So yes, I'm going to talk about a study published earlier this year by TNS, which focused on the usage and perceptions of ICT in public libraries across 17 EU member states. Just to give you a bit of background behind why the survey took place. The survey was actually supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Global Libraries Program. And this is a program which primarily puts computers, software, and access to free training to librarians in public libraries in order to support better socioeconomic outcomes for those communities and local development. And the programs take place in 5 EU member states currently: Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. And I think actually the Latvian example that the Vice President is referring to is connected to the country project supported by the Foundation in this instance. But alongside the work putting in computers and software and training librarians to maximize e-inclusion, there's also a wider effort at EU level to raise awareness of policymakers of the ability of public libraries across EU member states to contribute to pan-European policy objectives and address pan-European challenges. And as Gianluca was mentioning, there are obviously significant challenges at present. We've got 26 million unemployed Europeans, approaching 120 million on the verge of poverty and social exclusion. But there's also additional aspects like adult participation in lifelong learning is 8.9% across the EU, and the target for 2015 from the Commission is 15%. So there's a shortfall there. I think 50% of EU adults have either low or non-existent computer skills, and I believe, I'm always trying to get the latest stat on this, I think 120 million Europeans still have yet to use the internet, which obviously sometimes part to do with broadband coverage and access, and sometimes to do with skills and fear of going online. But so, as Robin mentioned, I was commissioned by the Foundation to do an analysis and review of the EU 2020 growth strategy and multi-annual financial framework, which sets out policy priorities and spending for the next 7 years from 2014 to 2020. And to cut a long story short, I ended up with focusing on 3 areas where public libraries are well positioned to assist with EU policy objectives. And a very brief summary: one was non-formal and informal learning, so perhaps a subset of lifelong learning. And it's very much about public libraries being able to offer the opportunity to accumulate skills and experiences which contribute to the capacity to pursue further training, maybe further education, or ultimately employment. The second dimension was social inclusion, and by that there's a number of different target groups that the EU wants to engage with as a means to reducing social exclusion. And obviously these would be disaffected young people, the elderly, women returners to the job market, and disadvantaged and excluded groups such as migrants and ethnic minority communities in many instances. And then on the digital inclusion side, obviously this is the topic of central focus of today, but I think the slide I was looking at from the perspective of the review was that to build a sort of sustainable, effective and competitive modern European information economy, we basically need to have an effectively functioning digital single market. And that means people engaging online, transacting online, buying, selling online, starting businesses online. And for that to actually happen, and to happen across border, across different member states, you need obviously access to technology and online resources, and also the skills to be able to exploit this. And so I think that's, the Commissioner obviously mentioned the economic arguments often somewhat more powerful than mere social arguments in abstraction. And obviously the point is to move forward and be globally competitive, maximize all the talents and abilities that the EU possesses. Digital inclusion is an underpinning platform and factor for the digital single market to be a reality. So I went on a bit longer on that one than I planned to. So why do we need a cross-European survey? I think part of it is about the fact that public libraries are traditionally rather invisible on the EU policy-making radar, apart from in the field of culture and books. I will make an exception for IPTS because they have emphasized libraries in a number of different studies and reports. So they're the exception that proves the rule in this instance, I would say. But certainly when looking through the EU 2020 growth strategy and associated policy frameworks, the mention of public libraries was only twice in maybe 4,000 pages of documents, which I think, given that so many of the documents focus on areas which public libraries are equipped to make a contribution, I think maybe there's a little gap. I put up on the slide a few reference points which are outside those frameworks which reference public libraries, but in the interest of time, I think I'll move on to the next slide. I think the only thing I will say is that there was a draft parliamentary resolution on the cultural and creative sectors in Parliament which mentioned public libraries as cultural actors which were capable of making contribution in terms of inclusion and skills, and obviously with associated economic benefits. And I think, unfortunately, 2 weeks ago, when the final text was approved, libraries got deleted. So it never got in there though. So that's hope for the future. But I guess the main thing about the survey is the concept of building the evidence base, in the sense that policymakers can be convinced by different types of data and evidence. In many instances, hearing this tale of a Bulgarian grandmother who speaks to her daughter who works in Paris in the financial sector over Skype is an excellent example of social and digital inclusion. But a lot of times policymakers want to hear not just isolated positive incidents, but an example that these incidents are replicatable and scalable across multiple areas, communities and member states. So the TNS survey itself, it was carried out in 17 member states, and that's approximately 80% of the population. And its focus was on 3 groups: library users, computer users in libraries, and a representative sample of the general population. So it wasn't just biased towards what people who use libraries already would say. And the respondents were all over 15 years old, so there are no children covered in the study. And one of the aspects which emerged was that there is an estimated 65,000 public libraries across the EU, and there was an interesting correlation between the level of public library funding and the usage rates. So, for example, in Finland, there were very high levels of spending per head population on libraries, but also at the same time very high levels of usage of public libraries. And obviously an implication which could be drawn is that a proper investment in the right level of services and resources in libraries yields greater value to library users and therefore increases demand. But focusing on the key findings, I think one specific aspect is that 100 million Europeans visited a public library in the last 12 months. That's 23% of the EU population. And 14 million used the library to access the internet and use computers in the last year. And 83% of those using public library computer and internet services reported benefits across a range of areas, including saving time and money, improving education and skills, providing access to e-government services, and increasing access to employment and health resources. So obviously that demonstrates a broad cross-section of benefits which aren't just to do with books or sort of culture as is traditionally perceived. I also think that the research also demonstrates that public libraries can be looked at as a digital lifeline in many instances. In terms of 1.9 million Europeans reported that public libraries are their only source of free internet access, which you can imagine if libraries didn't exist, that would be quite a large number of people who would be excluded. And those respondents, of those 1.9 million, they were most likely to be unemployed, over 65, disabled, or for Roma or ethnic minority community. I'll stop doing that. Right, the other aspect was non-formal and informal learning, which the survey showed that in the last 12 months, 24 million Europeans participated in those kind of learning activities in their library, and that those engaging in staff-assisted learning, as opposed to just doing their own research or using existing resources, tended to be unemployed from rural areas, over 65 years old, and also from tending to be from Roma or ethnic minority communities. one of the most interesting aspects of the TNS survey was the figures on employment. And I guess there's two key statistics. One is 1.5 million Europeans applied for jobs using free public library internet services and computer services last year. But what's more, 250,000 Europeans, so 250,000, found work using this access in their public library. And I think what's interesting about that is if you draw a very sort of crude comparison, in terms of contextualizing the 250,000. So the European Social Fund, which is a sort of 75 billion euro program over 7 years, the interim findings of the impact of that fund from 2007 to 2011 were published, and it said over those 5 years, it found work, or helped 2.4 million EU citizens to get into work, which effectively is 480,000 a year on average. So if we estimate the ESF costs 10 billion euros a year, and it gets 480,000 citizens into work, the public library network across the whole EU probably costs no more than 1.5 billion euros, and if it secures 250,000 library users jobs, I think that's relatively good return on investment in comparative terms. Moving on to social inclusion. One surprise, well, I don't know if it was a surprise, but interesting, was that young people aged 15 to 24 represented the largest demographic of public library computer and internet users, so that's 38% of the total. 60% of Roma users of public libraries and computers did so at least once a week, so obviously indicating that these services were of a high value to them. And 4.6 million EU citizens reported that they used the internet for the first time ever in a public library. So just to conclude, because I know time is running short, so I guess my analysis of the TNS research is that it provides concrete evidence that public libraries offer essential services to local communities and key marginalised and disadvantaged groups. They also offer free access to digital resources for many of those who have no other option whatsoever to access these facilities. And also that they are, potentially attractive spaces for young people to access ICT and the internet, given the significant proportion of computer users in libraries who are actually in the younger demographic. And I think drawing all this all together, it's about, concluding that public libraries, 65,000 strong network across the EU, represent a pre-existing community infrastructure which can really assist with the achievement of pan-European policy objectives, particularly in relation to the themes I've talked about: non-formal and informal learning, social and digital inclusion, and pathways to employment. And I think it's really about leveraging this research to nudge the needle in policy-making circles to understand that in addition to culture and books, which I think are, of course, very valuable commodities in and of themselves, there are added dimensions of what public libraries are doing in communities each and every day, which should be considered and coordinated with in terms of moving towards delivering both digital social inclusion and ultimately local development. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. I now know we need to do a little bit of gymnastics with the